26. In 1712, the government of Country Y appointed a censor to prohibit the publication of any book critical of Country Y's government. All new books legally published in the country after 1712 were approved by a censor. So let's see. In 1712, that's when the government appointed a censor, right? That year. So we know that after 1712, the censor must have been used, right? Under the first censor, 1/2 of the book manuscripts submitted were not approved. So in the first half, under the first censor, not first half. So under the first censor, we know that they said no to half the books, right? They said no to half the books. Under the next censor, only 1/4 of the books submitted were not approved. So in the second one, they said no to 1/4, right? Okay. But the number of book manuscripts that were approved was the same under both censors. So here, 1/2 of the books were approved, right? Under the first censor. Under the next one, it would be 3/4 were approved. Okay, and then they're saying these two, whatever this number is, they're equal, right? Okay. If the statements in the passage are true, which one of the following can be properly concluded from them? A. More books critical of Country Y's government were published before the appointment of the first censor than after it. Okay, so more books were published that were critical after. Let's see. This is easier to answer if we just have numbers to sub in, right? So let's just say it's 10. So 1/2 here would be 5 books. And if 5 books is 3/4, okay, basic math, that's not going to work. We need something that has 8. So let's pick 24, right? So 1/2 would be 12. So if 12 is 3/4, then this 1/4 here, right, would be 4. And then this 1/2 here would be 12. Right? Okay. So going off of that, A, more books critical of Country Y's government were published before the appointment of the first censor than after it. Do we know anything about what was published before the appointment of the first censor? Not really, right? This is the first censor. Do we know anything about what's going on before here? Not really, right? No, we don't. So we can cross out A for that reason. B, the first censor and the second censor prohibited the publication of the same number of manuscripts. Well, we know that's not true, right? If you look here, the first censor prohibited 3 times as many, right? No matter what numbers you put in here, the proportions will work out the same, right? So the first censor definitely prohibited the publication of more books, right? So we can cross out B for that reason. C, more book manuscripts were submitted for approval to the first censor than to the second censor. Well, we know that in the first, it's 24, and then we know that in the second, it's 16, right? So that would actually be true. Yeah, it would be 3-2, right? The ratio of books published would be 3-2. So more manuscripts would be submitted for approval to the first censor than the second, because the ratio would be 3-2. So there's basically 33% more books being submitted that first year, right? Or to that first censor, sorry. So C would probably be our answer here, but let's check out D and E. D, the second censor allowed some book manuscripts to be published that the first censor would have considered critical of country-wise government. Ooh, so D is talking about some specific books, or some book manuscripts, right, that were published one year but not the other year. We don't know anything about any specific books, right? We don't know that one censor would approve a certain book and that another wouldn't, so we can cross out D for that reason. E, the number of writers who wrote unpublished manuscripts was greater under the first censor than under the second censor. So the number of writers were greater. Unpublished manuscripts. Okay, so this is talking about unpublished manuscripts. Do we know anything about unpublished manuscripts? Anytime they talk about manuscripts here, right, it doesn't mention unpublished, right? Oh, actually, okay, so unpublished manuscripts could just be those that were not approved for publication. So that's not an issue. The real issue with E here, though, actually, is when they say the number of writers, right? Do we know anything about the number of writers? Not at all, right? We just know how many manuscripts there are throughout in terms of proportions, but we don't really know anything about, maybe one writer wrote all of the manuscripts, right? Maybe there were 10 writers. We have no idea how many writers wrote them because they never said. They never said the proportion of writers. They never said anything about writers, right? So that's why we can cross out E. So our answer here would be C. This one is pretty tricky because I think, at least for me, it's very hard to see what's going on unless I put in numbers for the proportions. If you don't have numbers in for the proportions, is it kind of harder to see that more books were submitted to the first censor than to the second? Yes, right? It's kind of hard to see that with just the proportions if you don't add in numbers yourself. If they give you only proportions, you can definitely add in numbers, right? And even though the numbers might change, which one's bigger and which one's smaller will not change because proportions, one is going to be bigger and one's going to be smaller, right? So no matter what numbers you decide to add in and how they work out, as long as you put in the proportions correctly, the bigger number will stay the bigger number no matter what numbers you choose for those proportions, if that makes sense. So C is the answer here.